I woke up to the sound of crackling flames. At first, I thought I was dreaming, maybe a campfire, maybe a summer barbecue. But the thick, acrid smoke pouring through my bedroom window told me otherwise. My chest tightened as I threw the sheets off and ran to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. My motorcycle, my police-issued, state-owned motorcycle, was engulfed in flames in my own driveway. Fire danced across its frame, licking at the pavement like some hellish bonfire. My first instinct was to grab the fire extinguisher, but even as I stumbled toward the door, I knew it was too late. The flames were too high, the damage already done. The heat hit my face the second I stepped outside, my bare feet smacking against the cool concrete. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the smoldering wreck. But beneath the shock, a slow-burning rage started to rise. That was when I heard it, laughter. I turned my head toward the house across the street, where a small group of people stood in the shadows of a perfectly trimmed lawn, wine glasses in hand. They clinked them together as if celebrating. My jaw clenched as recognition set in. It was the HOA board. Mrs. Pennington, their ever-so-smug president, stood front and center, whispering something to the others before flashing a self-satisfied grin in my direction. "Next time, follow the rules, Mr. Dawson," she called out, her voice dripping with condescension. For a moment, I was frozen in place. Not out of fear, not out of shock, but because I was trying to comprehend just how far these lunatics had gone. I had dealt with criminals, reckless drivers, and the occasional back-alley lunatic, but never had I seen suburban homeowners commit an outright felony over something this stupid. 2 days ago, these same people had knocked on my door with a welcome letter, a piece of paper wrapped in a veiled threat. The Homeowners Association, or as I had come to think of them, the neighborhood mafia, had made it clear that joining was highly encouraged. They spoke in that rehearsed, fake-friendly tone that made my skin crawl. They wanted control over my property, over my house, over where I parked my own damn vehicle. I had politely declined, not thinking much of it. Then the fines started rolling in. First, a notice for my grass being a half-inch too long. Then another one claiming my police motorcycle was a non-compliant vehicle and needed to be stored out of sight. A $500 fine. I had laughed at that one. Laughed and tossed it in the trash where it belonged. I wasn't part of their ridiculous little club, and they had no authority over me. Apparently, they hadn't taken that well. The fire department arrived within minutes, and soon my driveway was a chaotic mess of flashing lights and firefighters battling the flames. The smell of burnt rubber and scorched metal filled the air. I stood there, arms crossed, watching in silence as my bike, the very machine I had used to chase down criminals, respond to emergencies, and serve my community, was reduced to twisted, blackened scrap. One of the firefighters, a guy I knew from town, walked over and let out a low whistle. "Damn, Jack. What the hell happened?" I exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of my neck. "HOA happened." His brows shot up. "You serious?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. My jaw was clenched so tight my teeth hurt. I knew exactly who had done this. The security cameras on my property had captured every damn second. Hours later, when the fire was out and the wreckage was all that remained, I sat in my living room, reviewing the footage. My fingers tapped against the table as I watched the grainy black and white video play out. The HOA board, yes, the entire damn board, had crept onto my property in the dead of night. I watched as one of them, some balding guy in a sweater vest, poured gasoline over my bike like a psychopath. Another, a woman I recognized as Mrs. Pennington's right hand, lit the match. My eye twitched. There it was, video evidence. They had set fire to a police vehicle. Not just any vehicle, but a state-owned law enforcement motorcycle. Felony. A massive felony. And here's the best part. They had no idea who I really was. Sure, they knew I was a cop. They might have assumed I was just some low-level officer with a beat patrol and a bad attitude. But they didn't know I was a state trooper. They didn't know I had jurisdiction beyond their little suburban fiefdom. They had no clue they had just committed a federal-level crime right under the nose of someone who could bring their entire world crashing down. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile creeping onto my face. Oh, they had really screwed up this time. The next morning, as the sun painted the sky in soft hues of orange and blue, I stood outside with my arms crossed, watching as the HOA board gathered for their usual morning gossip session near the community garden. Mrs. Pennington, still dressed in her pearl necklace and power suit, like she was running for office, shot me a triumphant look. "Such a shame about your motorcycle," she called out, fake sympathy oozing from every syllable. "Perhaps next time, you'll reconsider our community guidelines." I smiled, a slow, deliberate, wolfish grin. "Oh, I definitely will," I replied, my tone light, almost playful. "In fact, I'd love to discuss it with all of you, maybe even over at the station." She blinked. The station? I pulled out my badge, flipping it open just enough for the sunlight to glint off it. Her expression changed instantly. Her smile faltered. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint right there on the sidewalk. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence evaporating like mist in the sun. "Yeah," I continued, enjoying the way her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "You know, seeing as how you and your little gang committed arson against state property, I figure we should have a proper chat about it. Maybe with a few of my colleagues, the ones who arrest people for felonies." Mrs. Pennington took a step back, then another. The other HOA members looked like deer caught in headlights. I let out a slow chuckle. "See you soon, folks." And with that, I turned and walked back into my house, leaving them to wallow in their incoming doom. Oh, this was going to be fun. The HOA members were panicking. It was obvious from the way they huddled together outside Mrs. Pennington's house, whispering in frantic tones. Some of them kept glancing at my house, their faces a mix of dread and confusion. I watched from my porch, sipping my morning coffee, enjoying the sight of their entire world unraveling before them. The same people who had smirked and laughed as they set my motorcycle on fire now looked like scared rats trapped in a sinking ship. And the best part? They still didn't know how deep in trouble they actually were. I had spent the entire night reviewing the security footage, making copies, and preparing my next move. It wasn't just about revenge, though let's be honest, that part was pretty satisfying. This was about justice, about making sure these power-hungry, self-important busybodies learned that they weren't above the law. They had played their little suburban mafia game for too long, terrorizing homeowners with their ridiculous rules and outrageous fines, thinking no one would ever stand up to them. Well, they had finally messed with the wrong guy. They had played their little suburban mafia game for too long, terrorizing homeowners with their ridiculous rules and outrageous fines, thinking no one would ever stand up to them. Well, they had finally messed with the wrong guy. By mid-morning, I got a call from the station. My buddy, Officer Martinez, had already seen the footage. His reaction was priceless. He had laughed for a full minute before saying, "You mean to tell me a bunch of soccer moms and retirees committed first-degree arson on a state trooper's bike? Oh man, this is going to be fun." He promised to handle the paperwork while I prepared for the next step. The HOA meeting was scheduled for noon. I didn't want to miss it, so after a quick breakfast, I got dressed in my casual off-duty clothes, grabbed my badge, and headed down the street. The meeting was being held at the community clubhouse, the same place where they had probably toasted to my misfortune the night before. When I walked through the doors, the room fell silent. Every single HOA board member was there, sitting at their long, polished table, looking at me like a ghost had just walked in. Mrs. Pennington was seated at the center, her expression carefully neutral, but the tight grip she had on her pen gave away her nerves. The other members shifted in their seats, avoiding my gaze, suddenly much less confident than they had been when they were setting my property on fire. "Mr. Dawson," Mrs. Pennington said finally, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" I took my time walking up to the table, letting the silence stretch between us. Then I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and turned it around for them to see. The footage played in full clarity. The gasoline, the match, the laughter, the flames. The color drained from Mrs. Pennington's face. Someone in the back let out a small, strangled gasp. "I think we need to have a little chat," I said, my voice calm, almost amused. The reaction was instant. The man in the sweater vest, the same one who had been a little too eager with the gasoline, shot to his feet. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "Sit down," I interrupted, my voice dropping to a tone I usually reserved for criminals. He sat. Mrs. Pennington took a shaky breath. "Mr. Dawson, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for this." "Oh, I'm sure there is," I said, crossing my arms. "I'd love to hear it. Maybe you can explain why a group of homeowners decided to commit felony arson over a parking dispute." No one said a word. I let the silence drag on before continuing. "Here's what's going to happen. In about an hour, officers will be arriving at your homes with arrest warrants. You see, unlike you, I don't just make up rules and fine people for existing. I actually enforce real laws. And setting fire to a police vehicle? That's a serious crime. So, congratulations. You all just turned your little HOA into a criminal organization." The panic in the room was palpable. One woman clutched her pearls like she was about to faint. Another man was sweating so hard it looked like he had run a marathon. But Mrs. Pennington, she was still trying to keep control. This is ridiculous," she said, though her voice lacked the usual confidence. "This is all a misunderstanding." I smirked. "Right? A misunderstanding. You accidentally poured gasoline on my bike. You accidentally lit the match." She licked her lips, searching for an argument. "You're blowing this out of proportion." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make the hair on her neck stand up. "Tell you what, why don't you call my captain and explain to him why you thought it was a good idea to burn a state-owned motorcycle? Maybe he'll see your side of things. Maybe he won't press for the maximum sentence." Her composure cracked. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but there was none. The other HOA members were shifting uncomfortably, clearly realizing that she had led them straight into disaster. Then the doors opened, and in walked two uniformed officers. Martinez was in the lead, looking entirely too amused at the whole situation. "Good afternoon, folks," he said cheerfully. "I've got some paperwork here with your names on it." Absolute chaos erupted. Some members tried to protest, but they were quickly silenced by the sight of handcuffs being pulled from belts. The woman who had clutched her pearls actually did faint this time, slumping dramatically against her chair. One man tried to run, only to be intercepted by another officer at the door. It was a full-blown meltdown. Mrs. Pennington stood up, her face red with fury. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "We are upstanding members of this community. You can't do this." Martinez just grinned. "Ma'am, you burned a cop's bike, and we can absolutely do this." One by one, the HOA members were handcuffed and escorted out. Some cried, some screamed, some begged for leniency. None was given. As I watched them being led to the squad cars, I couldn't help but shake my head. These people had spent years lording over others, thinking they were untouchable. They had bullied homeowners, fined them for absurd reasons, and acted as if they were above the law. But now they were just criminals. Martinez clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You know," he said, chuckling, "I've seen a lot of stupid criminals in my time, but this takes the cake." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in days. "Yeah," I said, watching as Mrs. Pennington was shoved into the back of a squad car, still screaming about how this was unfair. "It really does." As the last of the HOA members were driven away, I took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet, sweet scent of justice. The neighborhood was finally free. And damn, did it feel good. The neighborhood was quieter than it had been in years. Without the constant presence of the HOA lurking over every minor detail, things started to feel normal again. People mowed their lawns without fear of fines, parked their cars in their own driveways without receiving citations, and most importantly, no one was burning down state property in the middle of the night. The ridiculous reign of the HOA was over, and it was about time. The court case that followed was nothing short of a spectacle. The entire town had heard about the incident, and everyone wanted to see how it would play out. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing, and I had to fight the urge to laugh as I watched Mrs. Pennington march in, dressed in her finest clothes, acting as if she was walking into a gala instead of a criminal trial. She carried herself with the same smug attitude she always had, as if she truly believed that she was above the law. The other HOA members, however, were a different story. They looked like they had aged a decade overnight, their faces pale and filled with regret. The prosecution didn't hold back. The security footage was played in full view of the entire courtroom. Every moment was crystal clear. The gasoline being poured, the match being lit, the triumphant little celebration they had afterward. The gasps from the audience were audible. Even the judge had to pause for a moment before shaking his head in disbelief. Mrs. Pennington tried to argue that it was all just a misunderstanding. She claimed that they were simply trying to enforce community standards and that my refusal to comply had left them with no other choice. When that didn't work, she shifted tactics and tried to play the victim, claiming that they had been intimidated by me and that the fire was an accident. The judge was having none of it. "You expect me to believe," he said, rubbing his temples, "that 6 grown adults accidentally poured gasoline onto a police motorcycle, accidentally lit a match, and then accidentally stood around laughing while it burned?" Mrs. Pennington stammered, her carefully rehearsed words failing her. The judge didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the jury, who didn't even need to deliberate for long. The verdict came swiftly: guilty. Every single one of them. Sentencing day was even better. Some of them got probation, hefty fines, and community service. A few, including Mrs. Pennington and her closest lackeys, got actual jail time. She had been so certain she could talk her way out of it. But the moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, reality hit her hard. The woman who had ruled over this neighborhood with an iron fist was now just another criminal being escorted out of the courtroom. The fallout from the case was massive. The HOA was effectively dissolved overnight, with most of its board members behind bars or too ashamed to show their faces in public. There was no one left to keep it running. The community held a vote, and in record time, the HOA was officially disbanded. People celebrated like it was a national holiday. Someone even set off fireworks in their backyard, something that would have earned them a fine just a week earlier. The best part? The funds that had once been used to pay for the HOA's ridiculous rules and enforcement were now being put to better use. After some discussion with the neighborhood, we decided to turn the old HOA office into something useful, a community park. But not just any park. It was going to be a barbecue and gathering spot, a place where people could enjoy their own property without fear of being harassed over fence heights or the color of their front doors. I made sure to personally oversee the demolition of the HOA office. Watching that building get torn down was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Gone were the endless stacks of fines, the patronizing newsletters, the ridiculous regulations about mailbox styles. In their place would be picnic tables, a grill station, and a giant sign that read, "HOA Free Zone." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same land that had once been used to control people was now being used to bring them together. The first community barbecue was a massive success. Families who had been at odds for years over petty HOA disputes sat together, laughing, eating, and enjoying the freedom they had fought for. Even some of the police officers who had helped with the arrests showed up, Martinez included. He took one look at the banner I had hung over the grill station and burst out laughing. "You really named this the Anti-HOA Cookout?" he said, shaking his head as he grabbed a plate of food. "Damn right I did," I replied, flipping a burger. "Got to make sure no one ever forgets what happened here." People started sharing their horror stories about the HOA, trading tales of absurd fines and power-hungry board members. One guy talked about how he had been fined for having an improperly shaped flower bed. Another told a story about getting a citation because his trash can was visible for exactly 3 minutes past the HOA's strict pickup window. The more stories I heard, the more I realized just how much people had suffered under their ridiculous rule. But now they were free. As the sun started to set, I sat back in my chair, watching the community come together in a way it never had before. Kids were playing, neighbors were talking, and for the first time since I moved here, I actually felt like I belonged. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a new face. A guy, probably in his 40s, walking around the park, looking at the setup with interest. He eventually made his way over to where I was sitting and extended a hand. "Nice place you got here," he said. "I just moved into the neighborhood. Name's Greg." "Jack," I said, shaking his hand. He gestured toward the banner. "So, what happened to the old HOA?" I chuckled, glancing around at the happy, relaxed crowd. "They had a little accident with fire." Greg laughed, clearly thinking I was joking. "Well, sounds like this place is better off without them. Hey, speaking of which, have you guys thought about starting a new HOA? One that's a little more reasonable." I set my drink down, turned to look him dead in the eye, and grinned. "Greg, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that." The look of panic on his face was priceless. He held up his hands, laughing nervously. "Kidding. Totally kidding." I handed him a plate of barbecue. "Good. Now eat before I start writing fines." The night ended with fireworks, laughter, and a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. I had moved into this neighborhood looking for quiet, but I had found something even better. I had found a community worth fighting for. And in the end, that was better than any fine free lawn or perfectly measured flower bed. As I leaned back and took a deep breath, I realized one thing. I had one. And damn, did victory taste good. The days that followed were a blur of celebration and rebuilding. The neighborhood, once stifled by the HOA's oppressive rules, was now thriving. People painted their houses bold colors, planted wildflowers in their yards, and even built treehouses for their kids. Things that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. The community park became the heart of the neighborhood. Every weekend, families gathered for barbecues, games, and impromptu concerts. It was a far cry from the tense, rule-bound gatherings of the past. But not everyone was happy about the changes. A few of the former HOA members, now free on probation, tried to stir up trouble. They complained about the noise, the mess, and the lack of order. But their voices were drowned out by the laughter and joy of the community. Mrs. Pennington, now serving her sentence, tried to maintain her influence from behind bars. She sent letters to the local newspaper, claiming she had been unfairly targeted and that the neighborhood was descending into chaos without the HOA's guidance. No one paid her any attention. As for me, I became something of a local hero. People stopped me on the street to thank me, shake my hand, or offer me a plate of cookies. It was a strange feeling, being celebrated for something that had started as a personal vendetta. But I wasn't complaining. One evening, as I was grilling burgers at the park, Martinez showed up with a six-pack of beer. "Figured you could use a drink," he said, handing me a bottle. "Thanks," I said, cracking it open. "What brings you here?" He shrugged. "Just wanted to see how the neighborhood was doing. And, make sure you weren't turning into a tyrant yourself." I laughed. "Not a chance. I've had enough of rules and fines to last a lifetime." We sat in silence for a while, watching the kids play and the neighbors chat. It was peaceful. A word I hadn't associated with this neighborhood in a long time. Martinez said after a while, "you could have handled this differently. You could have just paid the fines, joined the HOA, and avoided all this drama." I shook my head. That's the thing, though. It wasn't just about the fines or the rules. It was about standing up to people who thought they could control others just because they had a little power. If I hadn't fought back, they would have kept pushing, kept bullying, until there was nothing left of this community but fear and resentment. Martinez nodded. "Yeah, I get that. Still, it's pretty wild how far they went. I mean, burning your bike? That's next-level crazy." "Tell me about it," I said, taking a sip of my beer. "But you know what? In a weird way, I'm glad they did it. If they hadn't, I might not have realized how much this neighborhood needed someone to stand up for them." Martinez raised his bottle. "To standing up, then." I clinked my bottle against his. "To standing up." As the sun set and the park filled with the warm glow of string lights, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just my victory, it was everyone's. And as long as we stuck together, no one would ever take that away from us. The weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood continued to flourish. The park became a symbol of our newfound freedom, a place where people could gather without fear of judgment or fines. It wasn't just a physical space. It was a reminder of what we had overcome. But not everything was perfect. The absence of the HOA left a void in some ways. Without their strict rules, a few homeowners started pushing the boundaries. One guy decided to turn his front yard into a makeshift auto repair shop, complete with rusted car parts and oil stains on the driveway. Another family painted their house neon green, which, while not technically against any rules, was, well, an eyesore. At first, I tried to ignore it. After all, freedom meant people could do what they wanted with their property, right? But as the complaints started rolling in, I realized that there was a fine line between freedom and chaos. One evening, as I was walking home from the park, I ran into Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She was standing on her porch, shaking her head at the neon green house across the street. "Can you believe this, Jack?" she said, gesturing toward the house. "It's like a circus out here." I sighed. "I know, Mrs. Henderson, but people have the right to express themselves, I guess." She gave me a pointed look. "There's expressing yourself, and then there's this. You're the one who got rid of the HOA. Don't you think you should do something about it?" Her words stuck with me. She was right. I had been the one to dismantle the HOA, and now I felt a sense of responsibility for the neighborhood. But I didn't want to become the very thing I had fought against. The next day, I called a meeting at the park. It wasn't an official HOA meeting, just a gathering of neighbors who wanted to discuss how to maintain the balance between freedom and order. To my surprise, almost everyone showed up. People brought lawn chairs, snacks, and even a few kids who played on the swings while we talked. "All right," I said, standing on a picnic table to address the crowd. "We all know why we're here. We got rid of the HOA because we wanted freedom. But freedom doesn't mean we can just do whatever we want without considering how it affects others. So, let's talk about how we can keep this neighborhood a place we're all proud to call home." The discussion was lively, to say the least. Some people argued for stricter rules, while others insisted on maintaining complete freedom. In the end, we reached a compromise. A set of voluntary guidelines that encouraged respect and consideration without the threat of fines or punishment. For example, we agreed to keep yards tidy, avoid excessive noise after 10 p.m., and consult with neighbors before making major changes to our properties. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As the meeting wrapped up, Mrs. Henderson approached me with a smile. "You did good, Jack," she said. "This is what a real community looks like." I nodded, feeling a sense of relief. Maybe we didn't need an HOA to keep things in check. Maybe all we needed was a little communication and mutual respect. Life in the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The voluntary guidelines worked surprisingly well, and for the most part, people respected them. The neon greenhouse was repainted a more subdued shade of blue, and the auto repair shop guy agreed to move his operations to his backyard. But just when I thought things were finally calm, a new challenge arose. One morning, as I was sipping my coffee on the porch, I noticed a moving truck parked a few houses down. A family was unloading boxes, and I recognized the man from the park, Greg, the guy who had joked about starting a new HOA. I walked over to introduce myself. "Hey Greg, welcome to the neighborhood." He smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thanks, Jack. Glad to be here. This place seems great." "It is," I said. "But just so you know, we don't have an HOA anymore. We've got some voluntary guidelines, though. I can fill you in if you're interested." He waved a hand. "Nah, I'm good. I'm all about freedom, you know? Do what you want when you want. That's my motto." I nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. "Well, if you need anything, let me know." Over the next few weeks, Greg's freedom became a topic of conversation in the neighborhood. He parked his beat-up van on the street for days at a time, played loud music late into the night, and let his dog roam freely, leaving messes in people's yards. At first, people tried to talk to him about it, but he brushed them off. "It's my property," he'd say. "I can do what I want." The complaints started piling up, and once again, I found myself in the middle of a neighborhood dispute. One evening, I knocked on Greg's door. He answered with a beer in hand, looking surprised to see me. "Hey Jack, what's up? We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "People are upset about the noise and the mess. I know you value your freedom, but you've got to respect your neighbors too." He frowned. "Respect goes both ways, man. If they don't like it, they can mind their own business." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that this wasn't the HOA. I couldn't force him to do anything. "Look, Greg, we're not trying to control you. We just want to live in a place where everyone feels comfortable. Can't we find a middle ground?" He crossed his arms. "I'll think about it." It wasn't the response I was hoping for, but it was a start. The next day, I called another neighborhood meeting. This time, the focus was on how to handle conflicts like this without resorting to rules or fines. The discussion was heated, but eventually we came up with a plan. A neighborhood mediation committee. If someone had a problem with a neighbor, they could bring it to the committee, and we'd work together to find a solution. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step toward building a community based on communication and understanding rather than control. As I left the meeting, I couldn't help but smile. This was what I had fought for. A neighborhood where people could live freely, but also care for one another. And as long as we kept talking, I knew we'd be okay. The mediation committee turned out to be a game changer. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements and occasional frustrations, but it gave people a way to address issues without resorting to fines or threats. For the most part, it worked. Greg, however, remained a challenge. Despite multiple conversations and mediation attempts, he continued to push the boundaries. His dog still roamed the neighborhood, his music still blared late at night, and his van remained a permanent fixture on the street. People were starting to lose patience. One evening, as I was walking home from the park, I ran into Mrs. Henderson again. She was standing on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at Greg's house. "This is getting out of hand, Jack," she said. "That man is a menace. If we don't do something soon, this neighborhood is going to fall apart." I sighed. "I know, Mrs. Henderson, but we're trying to handle this without becoming like the HOA. It's a delicate balance." She shook her head. "Sometimes you need a little authority to keep things in order. Freedom is great, but it's not a free-for-all." Her words stuck with me. Maybe she was right. Maybe we needed to rethink our approach. The next day, I called a meeting with the mediation committee. We needed to come up with a solution, one that respected people's freedom but also ensured the neighborhood remained a pleasant place to live. After hours of discussion, we landed on an idea: a neighborhood covenant. It wouldn't be enforced by fines or threats, but it would outline clear expectations for behavior and property maintenance. Everyone who signed it would agree to follow the guidelines voluntarily. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step toward finding balance. We presented the covenant at the next neighborhood meeting. To my relief, most people were on board. Even Greg showed up, though he looked less than thrilled. "This sounds a lot like an HO," he said, crossing his arms. "It's not," I replied. "It's just a way for us to agree on how we want to live together. No fines, no threats, just mutual respect." He grumbled but eventually signed the covenant, along with everyone else. For a while, things improved. Greg kept his music at a reasonable volume. His dog stayed in his yard, and his van even moved off the street. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Then, one morning, I woke up to the sound of shouting. I rushed outside to find Greg standing in the middle of the street, arguing with Mrs. Henderson. His dog was barking wildly, and his van was parked diagonally across two driveways. "What's going on?" I asked, stepping between them. "This man is a menace," Mrs. Henderson shouted. "His dog dug up my flower bed, and he won't even apologize." Greg rolled his eyes. "It's just a few flowers, lady. Chill out." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Greg, you signed the covenant. You agreed to respect your neighbors." He shrugged. "Yeah, well, maybe I changed my mind. You can't tell me what to do." It was clear that talking wasn't going to work this time. We needed a new approach. The situation with Greg came to a head at the next neighborhood meeting. People were fed up, and the tension in the room was palpable. "We can't keep letting him get away with this," one neighbor said. "He's ruining the neighborhood for everyone." "I agree," another added. "We need to do something before it gets worse." I stood up, holding up my hands to quiet the room. "I know everyone's frustrated. I am too. But we can't let this tear us apart. We need to find a solution that works for everyone." After a long discussion, we decided to try one last mediation session with Greg. If that didn't work, we'd have to consider more serious measures. The next day, I knocked on Greg's door. He answered with a smirk, clearly expecting me. "Let me guess," he said. "You're here to tell me how to live my life again." "I'm here to talk," I said, keeping my tone calm. "We all signed the covenant because we want this neighborhood to be a good place to live. But if you're not willing to respect that, we need to figure out what to do next." He crossed his arms. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means we're at a crossroads," I said. "Either we find a way to work together, or we have to consider other options." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he sighed. "Look, I get it. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I just don't like being told what to do." "No one's telling you what to do," I said. "We're just asking you to be considerate. That's all." He nodded slowly. "All right, I'll try. But no promises." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Greg made an effort to follow the covenant. His dog stayed in his yard, his music stayed at a reasonable volume, and his van even found a permanent spot in his driveway. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun set over the park, I felt a sense of pride. We had faced challenges, but we had worked through them together. This was what a real community looked like. Not a place ruled by fines and threats, but a place where people cared for one another and worked together to solve problems. And as long as we kept that spirit alive, I knew we'd be okay. The neighborhood continued to thrive, and the park remained the heart of our community. It wasn't just a place for barbecues and gatherings. It was a symbol of what we had built together. People started taking pride in their homes again, planting gardens, painting fences, and even organizing block parties. But just when I thought we had finally found our rhythm, a new challenge emerged. One morning, as I was walking to the park, I noticed a group of people gathered near the entrance. They were holding signs and chanting something I couldn't quite make out. As I got closer, I realized what was happening. A protest. "What's going on?" I asked, approaching Mrs. Henderson, who was standing at the edge of the crowd. She shook her head, looking frustrated. "It's the new development. They're planning to build a shopping center on the edge of the neighborhood. These people are here to stop it." I frowned. A shopping center? That didn't sound so bad. "Why are they protesting?" "Because it's going to ruin the character of the neighborhood," she said. "All that traffic, noise, and pollution. It's going to change everything." I looked around at the crowd. There were familiar faces. Neighbors I had fought alongside to dismantle the HOA, and new ones, people I didn't recognize. They were passionate, waving signs that read, "Save our neighborhood," and "No more development." It was clear that this was going to be another test for our community. The next day, I called a meeting at the park to discuss the issue. To my surprise, the turnout was even bigger than usual. People were divided. Some were in favor of the development, while others were vehemently opposed. "This could bring jobs and convenience to the area," one neighbor argued. "We could have a grocery store, a pharmacy, maybe even a coffee shop." "At what cost?" another countered. "Our quiet streets will be overrun with traffic. Our property values will plummet. This isn't what we fought for." The debate was heated, and it quickly became clear that we weren't going to reach a consensus anytime soon. As the meeting wrapped up, I stood up to address the crowd. "I know this is a tough issue, and people have strong feelings about it. But we need to remember what we've built here. We've created a community where we can talk through our differences and find solutions together. Let's not lose sight of that." The room fell silent, and for a moment, I thought I had gotten through to them. Then Greg stood up. "Yeah, well, talking isn't going to stop a shopping center. If we want to save this neighborhood, we need to take action." The crowd erupted into cheers, and I realized that this was going to be a much bigger challenge than I had anticipated. The protest against the shopping center grew louder and more organized. Greg, of all people, had become one of its leaders. He was passionate, charismatic, and relentless, qualities that made him both a formidable ally and a frustrating opponent. "We need to make our voices heard," he said at the next neighborhood meeting. "If we don't fight back, they're going to bulldoze this place and turn it into a concrete jungle." His words struck a chord with many people, and soon the protest had spread beyond our neighborhood. News crews showed up, and the story made headlines. But not everyone was on board. Some neighbors, like Mrs. Henderson, were wary of Greg's methods. "He's stirring up trouble," she said to me one evening. "This isn't about the neighborhood anymore. It's about him." I nodded, feeling the same unease. Greg's passion was admirable, but his approach was becoming increasingly confrontational. The breaking point came when the protests turned violent. A group of demonstrators clashed with construction workers at the development site, and several people were injured. The next day, I called an emergency meeting. "This has gone too far," I said, addressing the crowd. "We can't let this divide us. We need to find a way to address this issue without resorting to violence." Greg stood up, his face red with anger. "You're just scared to stand up for what's right. If we don't fight back, we're going to lose everything." "Fighting isn't the answer," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We need to work together, not tear each other apart." The room was divided, and it was clear that we were at a crossroads. The next day, I reached out to the developers. It wasn't easy. They were wary of meeting with a group of angry homeowners, but I managed to arrange a sit-down. At the meeting, I presented our concerns: the traffic, the noise, the impact on our property values. To my surprise, they listened. "We understand your concerns," the lead developer said, "and we're willing to make some changes to address them." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. They agreed to reduce the size of the shopping center, add more green space, and implement traffic calming measures. When I presented the compromise to the neighborhood, the response was mixed. Some people were relieved, while others felt it wasn't enough. Greg, of course, was furious. "You sold us out," he said, glaring at me. "This isn't what we fought for." "It's a compromise," I said. "Sometimes, that's the best we can do." He shook his head. "Not good enough." The next day, Greg moved out of the neighborhood. It was a bittersweet victory. We had managed to address the issue without tearing each other apart, but we had lost a member of our community in the process. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over the park, I realized that building a community wasn't just about fighting for what we believed in. It was about finding a way to live together, even when we disagreed. And as long as we kept that in mind, I knew we'd be okay. The compromise with the developers brought a sense of calm back to the neighborhood. The protests died down, and people began to focus on rebuilding the sense of unity we had worked so hard to create. The park, once again, became a place of laughter and connection rather than conflict. But Greg's departure left a void. He had been a polarizing figure, but he had also been a part of our community. His absence was felt, especially by those who had supported his passionate stance against the shopping center. One evening, as I was walking through the park, I ran into Mrs. Henderson. She was sitting on a bench, watching a group of kids play on the swings. "It's quiet without him, isn't it?" she said, gesturing toward the spot where Greg's house stood. I nodded. "Yeah, he was a pain, but he cared about this place." She sighed. "Sometimes I think we forget that. We get so caught up in our differences that we forget we're all here for the same reason, to make this neighborhood a better place." Her words stayed with me. Greg's passion had been a double-edged sword, but it had also reminded us of what we were fighting for. The next day, I called a meeting at the park. It wasn't about the shopping center or the protests. It was about us. "We've been through a lot," I said, addressing the crowd. "We've fought for our freedom, stood up to bullies, and faced challenges together. But we've also lost people along the way. Greg may not be here anymore, but his passion reminded us of what we're capable of when we come together." The room was quiet, and for a moment, I thought I had lost them. Then Mrs. Henderson stood up. "Jack's right. We've built something special here, but we can't take it for granted. We need to keep working together, even when it's hard." Her words sparked a conversation, and soon people were sharing ideas for how to strengthen our community. Some suggested organizing more events at the park, while others talked about starting a neighborhood watch or a community garden. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan. A neighborhood council. It wouldn't be like the HOA, there would be no fines or threats, but it would give us a way to address issues and work together to keep the neighborhood thriving. It was a small step, but it felt like a new beginning. The neighborhood council was a success. It gave people a way to voice their concerns and work together to find solutions. We organized cleanup days, started a community garden, and even hosted a neighborhood talent show. But the biggest change was in how we handled conflicts. Instead of letting disagreements tear us apart, we talked through them. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. One evening, as I was walking home from the park, I noticed a moving truck parked in front of Greg's old house. A family was unloading boxes, and I recognized the man from the protests, one of Greg's most vocal supporters. I walked over to introduce myself. "Hey, I'm Jack. Welcome to the neighborhood." He smiled, shaking my hand. "Thanks. I'm Mike. I've heard a lot about this place." "Good things, I hope," I said, half joking. He laughed. "Mostly. I know there's been some drama, but I also know this is a community that fights for what it believes in. That's why I wanted to move here." His words surprised me. After everything we had been through, it was easy to forget that people still saw us as a place worth fighting for. Over the next few weeks, Mike became an active member of the neighborhood. He joined the council, helped organize events, and even started a weekly yoga class in the park. It was a reminder that, no matter how much we had been through, there was always room for growth and new beginnings. The neighborhood continued to evolve, and the park remained the heart of our community. It wasn't just a place for barbecues and gatherings. It was a symbol of what we had built together. One evening, as I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the park, I felt a sense of pride. We had faced challenges, but we had worked through them together. This was what a real community looked like. Not a place ruled by fines and threats, but a place where people cared for one another and worked together to solve problems. As I leaned back and took a deep breath, I realized one thing. We had won. And damn, did victory taste good.